The purpose of this video is to explain to you where we are in terms of regulation and politics, but also to request, require and generally encourage you to come and join Libertatem. Now, where are we at the moment? Well, at the moment we have a regulatory system which is unaccountable. It's unaccountable to Parliament, even though Parliament created it, and it is notionally unaccountable to the Treasury, although actually the Treasury has very significant influence on it. That makes it rather difficult for smaller IFAs whose access to the political process is generally through their local MP, and their local MP is told by the Treasury that actually the Treasury has nothing to do with regulation. This is complete nonsense, of course, but is still very much the excuse. So as people go out to their MPs, they may well get letters back from the Treasury declaiming all responsibility for the current regulatory regime. It doesn't rub and it doesn't matter if you get that sort of letter. It's far more important that we've made the effort to actually ask the question rather than necessarily to get a letter with the right answer, because we need to change things, and a statement of the status quo really doesn't take us very far. So in terms of getting this system more accountable, the way forward for IFAs is to get into their backbenchers and to sort out with the backbenchers what they think of the current regulatory system. Well, I can give you some insights on that because we've been working with the backbenchers for the last year. And over 80 of them in January appeared at a debate which was set up by the members of Parliament themselves, which was a vote of no confidence in the Financial Conduct Authority. Now, no regulator in history has ever had a vote of no confidence created for it on the floor of the House of Commons. It's just unheard of. And so therefore, the FCA and its acolytes do not have great friends at the moment, certainly in the House of Commons. This was added to by a German debate on the Connaught Fund, which was, is a cause célèbre, not least because the regulator had been told that the fund was fraudulent and had failed to act. And finally, a lot of work has been done by the Treasury Select Committee with regulation, and they are very much on the ball in terms of understanding what needs to be done and what has to be done. So we are just adding to that pressure. Now, sadly, since January, as you well know, we've had Brexit, which really took political eyes off the ball right the way between then and the eventual referendum vote. Immediately after that referendum vote, indeed within 3 days, members of Parliament went on holiday and will only come back in the next week. So we've now got a fantastic opportunity to start influencing the political process and to start getting involved. Now, what is the type of influence we seek, and why do we think the current system is not working? Well, the major problem we have is unaccountability. Everything else sort of flows from that. So I know, for instance, lots of advisors get very wound up about long stop. Well, long stop is very much a feature of having an unaccountable regulator. They wouldn't get away with it if they were accountable. Similarly, the way that the costs of FCS are distributed basically, the most obvious thing, and everyone in the industry knows it, will be some form of charge on investments, those investments held by the IFA sector. But again, that hasn't happened. We arrive with a number of good statistics from the Heath report. And the Heath report showed that historically, the IFA sector has advised 16 million clients. Now, that doesn't mean each of those clients is on intimate terms with their regulator. Just simply that at some point, someone has come into an independent financial advisor and sought advice. Those 16 million people no longer have that access, and indeed the Heath report describes that nearly 10 million of them no longer have access to an independent financial advisor. But in terms of FSCS, those numbers are also standing up, because we have, in effect, 16 million potential claimants of the Financial Services Compensation Scheme. However, we only now have 7 million clients who are actually paying advisors for advice. So the FSCS, which is in essence is an internal insurance policy between those being advised and those who have been advised. Simply doesn't work. We have too many claimants being funded by too few currently advised, and those numbers will continue to drop, we believe, as many advisors continue to cut down the number of those they seek to advise. So this has to be changed, and we have to provide proper pressure for it to be changed. So that is certainly, the FSS is one of the major areas. But like so much of the things that irk us, it really is just a factor of the regulator being unaccountable. The Heath report has gone all over the world. Even the United Nations has copies of the Heath report. And it really describes independently what the effect was on the provision of advice for consumers. Now, be very careful on this. I'm talking about the provision of advice for consumers. I'm not talking about the quality. In that lack of provision, we've looked at the way banks have exited the advice area. Now, I'm not saying bank advice was much good. Indeed, many of it was contrary to the needs of their clients, but at least there was somebody to go to. Now, that access at the moment no longer exists, although, as we know, Farmer will bring something new to the party at the moment. So where are we with regulation, and what can we do about it? Well, firstly, regulation at the moment is a one-size-fits-all system, created basically for the banks. The banks campaign very heavily to have everybody in one regulator. It sounds very quickly like a good idea, but in reality it means that most of IFAs are treated like mini banks. Secondly, the smaller player has very little influence over regulation itself, and this we're seeing more and more. I don't think there's any grand plan to get rid of independent financial advice or financial planners or anything else. But people get lost in the wayside, and there is some very expensive lobbying going on by banks and larger players, both on the Treasury and on the regulator, and that cost is not wasted. They do get positive results from it. And we as advisors are very poor at funding the same type of effort. So at the moment we're being regulated rather like small banks. We are, though, increasingly a profession. We need to start thinking about how we might start being regulated as a profession, as professionals, under professional rules. So, for instance, capital adequacy is not a judgment of a professional's financial probity. Solvency is. Every accountant, solicitor, doctor, whoever you wish to choose, all have solvency as their version of proving themselves financially to their regulator. We have a system which only ever works for banks. The bigger the numbers are in terms of capital adequacy, the worse it is for the smaller player. And therefore the larger players are constantly canvassing for higher levels of capital adequacy. Now that brings me to another area which we need to think about, which is why do we actually need to represent ourselves? And on what basis? There are two things that we find that we face. One are immediate problems, and the other is a surrender of principle. And quite often we get wound up about the immediate problem and forget we are surrendering the principle. I'll take you back to capital adequacy, just simply because it's a particularly good example. At the time it was introduced with a 10,000 cost. And that cost could be anything, assets, cars, anything that's readily available for sale. And the vast majority of IFAs had that in their businesses quite easily. So a lot of IFAs were saying, oh, well, let's not worry about that, it's okay. Yes, the actual amount was okay. But the principle left you open. What if it wasn't 10K, it was 100K? How many people would then find that they were exposed to it? And at that time we did a survey and we found that we would have lost 97% of the IFA industry if it had gone up to £100,000. So you always have to look for the principle as well as the problem. We similarly have current issues with principle as well with RDR. With RDR, we have allowed the regulator to start putting himself between you and your client. The regulator has now said to the client that the client can only pay their fees by cash. They can't use commission, for instance, certainly on investment products. Now that again is a principle. Once the regulator is allowed to interfere between you and your client and that relationship, where does that interference stop? Oh, wait a minute, Gary, you're looking for problems that don't exist. Well, really? At the time of RDR, I suggested that the next move might be that the regulator started looking at the amount that was charged for advice. And over the last 2 or 3 weeks, what have we seen? Yes, they are now looking at the amount for advice. So a lot of advisors who are at the moment very content with their lives, dealing with a relatively small number of clients and charging them a reasonably decent amount of money, may suddenly find the regulator interfering in that process too. So the whole point of Libertatem is not only to fight the immediate problems, but to look at the principles that lay behind them and see what can be changed. If we're going to have a profession, we need to now start moving away from being treated like small banks and start actually being treated like professionals. I think we're ready for that as a sector, and it's time that we started campaigning for that. And as part of that, Libertatem has been looking at a thing we've just referred to as the professional advisors regulator. This could include all IFA and similar activity, could include insurance brokers. There are a number of ways forward on this, and it needs to be examined. Clearly, there will be some people who will not want it, not least those who are earning very significant funds via the current system. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be looking at it and shouldn't be discussing it in Parliament and elsewhere. So what is Libertatem's beef with the regulator? Well, apart from the unaccountability, which we'll come back to, it is actually a very inefficient process. Why should it take an IFA practice 6 months to actually transfer itself from a partnership to a limited company? It makes no sense at all. Similarly, the regulator itself is not properly policing the situation. Now we can look at matrix data, we can look at Harlequin, and in particular we can look at Connaught. And they're not the only ones by any means, where the regulator was had information which it had but did not pass to others, and did not act quickly enough to actually close the company down. Alternatively, some companies found themselves closed down really on regulatory whim. So both ways, it hasn't worked. The next area is the whole operational situation with FOSS, the Financial Ombudsman Service. Here there is a presumption that all advisors have access to their clients' funds. FOSS works very well really for banks and for insurance companies because in essence they're moving the money within the organisation around to different clients. In an IFA situation, any payments that are made either comes out of his PI insurance or out of his own personal finances. And this makes it far more personal for advisors than it does for the larger firms. Now, FOSS wants to maintain the maximum width it can possibly get to make judgments. It wants to make judgments that no civil court would make. In doing that, it compromises PI insurance. And as part of the pack of downloads from the High Wycombe meeting, you will see a video from our PI insurers, Lockton's, who both sponsored the event and also appeared, talking about the effect of FOSS decisions on PI insurance. It's a very good 5 minutes to read or to watch, and I would commend it to you. So we cannot continue to allow the regulator just make it up as they go along. To receive 2 cases in FOSS, one of which is made as a judgment and the other one isn't. We've got to bring back the Ombudsman Service to being a parallel universe to what you might get in a civil court, so that the PI insurance actually sits alongside it. This will suit the PI insurers, it will suit the advisors, but there will be some in regulation that do not want this, not least because they see their job as getting rid of problems to the powerful rather than actually protecting the consumer. So that is another area which we will be working on And it's another area where unaccountability not only works between the unaccountability of the regime to Parliament, but the unaccountability of the regime within itself. FOSS is actually making decisions that completely compliant advice still requires payment, and that again cannot be allowed to continue. Does this mean that actually we can change anything? Is change possible? Well, we've been living for the last 20 years in a particular political climate. A climate of those who have come from Oxbridge, who believe that they have knowledge on everything, and that they, and only they, can make decisions. Now, we saw that with the Blair government, with the Brown government, with the coalition government, and up to the last minutes of the Cameron government before Brexit. The idea that anyone outside the Westminster bubble could possibly have any wisdom that was of any use to making law, regulating anything or anything else, was an anathema to the status quo ante. That creates huge problems, not least further down the supply chain. So the same sort of confidence starts being exuded by regulators and others who believe that they, and only they, have a mission to sort out the industry, and that the industry must be against them simply because they don't agree with the way they're doing it. Well, we now have real change. And the new status quo with Theresa May's government is going to make a huge difference, potentially, to the lot of advisors. Gone are all the bright young things from Eton and Oxbridge, with their PPEs and their special advisor status. And in have come ministers who actually have business experience. All our three ministers, the Chancellor and the two others, all have run their own businesses. And now we are beginning to be able to talk to people who actually might understand what we're talking about. But that requires us to actually show some effort and some involvement. Libertatem has been running now for 18 months. Most people thought it was going to fail. Well, it hasn't failed. It's actually thrived in a reasonable manner, but it needs to get much, much bigger before it can really offer the service that this sector requires. And we're working on that, but we need your help to do it. So what is Libertatem's internal agenda for change? Well, for us to start to be really effective, to have the people here at Clare, the Clare Foundation, in the numbers that we require, we need at least 2,000 advisor firms in membership. We've got a few hundred, we're doing okay, but we need to do a lot more. And a lot of IFAs, frankly, have told us they're going to join, but have yet to actually arrive. As you can see, I have a flat spot on the top of my head because I've been patted so often recently, told what a wonderful job I've been doing, and isn't it great to see me back? Yeah, sorry, that doesn't actually pay any bills. So we have got to get more people into membership. Now, later last week, I went to a meeting in Witney, and one of the people at the meeting in Witney actually, I think, expressed something that a number of advisors have been thinking but not saying. And that is, will the current regulator exact some form of revenge on advisors if they join Libertatem? Well, firstly, the regulator won't know who Libertatem members are. We're not going to tell them. If they ask, they're not going to have a very pleasant response. That is not our job. As far as we're concerned, our membership is private. But secondly, the regulator themselves is now in a very, very weak position. I mentioned earlier that the vote of no confidence and a number of other measures have put them in a very, very poor position themselves. The Treasury really doesn't have the confidence in the process that it used to have. So we are now beginning to see a weakness involved in the regulator itself. But far more importantly, advisors have got to make a decision. Some have said to me, well, actually, I only want to run another 5 years. As long as I can exist for 5 years and I can retire and sell my company to somebody, then I don't need to get involved in all this. Well, there's an issue there. Who are you going to sell your company to if the current situation continues to get worse? It's a very short-term thought. And secondly, if we're going to be a profession, which everyone keeps saying they wish to be, we have to be more collegiate in our thinking. We have to work together and unite to actually achieve something. So our first need at Libertatem is to create more members. The upside of that is that we can then start to have proper regions. We can start to actually elect our directors rather than, as we have done, appointed them, basically from being supporters of the Heath report. So we need to now move to a far more democratic process, and that we are busy moving ourselves to. And in some areas we will be able to launch new local coordinators. Indeed, we already have them in Lancashire, in Yorkshire, and we're hoping to move some into Kent and also the home counties. So we're beginning now to start a local structure, and that's really important for us to thrive and continue. Secondly, we need to create a commercial arm for the association. A lot of people realise the need to be in a trade association but don't actually want to pay the money. They quite rightly think that if they can keep their hands in their pockets, somebody else will pay for it. Of course, if everybody thought like that, we wouldn't have any funds at all. But it does suit us very much to have a commercial wing. As you assemble more and more advisors, you actually are assembling a group of people with buying power, and we can create a number of deals which make sense. At the moment, Lockton's our PI insurance is one of those deals. We also have a similar deal with a company called Cascade, and more deals are in the pipeline, and we'll be bringing them to members in the autumn and beyond. So that again is an important thing that Libertatem is attempting to do. So what is our external agenda for change? Well, firstly, we must make regulation more accountable. I've harped on about that for the last 10 minutes, but it is absolutely the crux of the matter. Unless the regulator is accountable, then it can do whatever it feels like it wishes to do at any time it wishes to do it. That is not something that is going to give any long-term benefit to the sector. And one of the things that I've noticed is that the sector is very, very thin in terms of incoming capital. And having attempted to bring some incoming capital in the sector, I can tell you the reason why. Those investing who are keen to invest in the financial services sector do not trust the actions of the regulator. And they are very much slowing down any possible developments in both the independent advice sector and also in other sectors too. Only those who already have capital, like banks and insurance companies, will be those who start to increase their organisation, particularly under things like pharma. Secondly, we've got to have proper policing. We can't have a situation in Connaught where someone flies in from New York with a suitcase full of evidence that proves that the company he used to work for is fraudulent. And not only is the evidence not looked at properly, but he is then attacked by the regulator for bringing it. That again is not the way forward, and we have to change things. We have to realise that the FCA's one-size-fits-all doesn't work. It certainly doesn't work for the smaller advisor who finds themselves being pressured with gay bills and all sorts of other activities in a way that frankly bears little relationship to the sort of work that he does, and creates a huge amount of cost for the advisor in the running of their business. So we need to then move to the longer term aim, which is to create a professional advisor regulator for the sector, so that we can actually start to look like a profession, not just talk about looking like a profession. A lot of Libertatem's members, and I'm sure this is true of the sector as a whole, are very professional people. They act very professionally and for the benefit of their clients. That's great, but at the moment, thanks to the regulatory system you're in, you actually do not get any benefit from it. It's very interesting to see last year that the regulator said there should be no regulatory dividend. Well, any other form of regulation has one. So why do we, as advisors, not have a regulatory dividend? Why are we not seeing more business flowing? Because we're properly regulated. Finally, we've got to ensure that financial services compensation scheme is paid for by an external charge. That is the only way forward for the 16 million to actually fund their own cover, and for the cover not to be foisted on the 6 million, 7 million who are now taking advice. The cost of regulation for most clients is in effect around 25% of the fees they pay. That is a huge amount of money, and if you're charging VAT, of course there's another 20% on top of that. Increasingly there are other people in our industry who are making more money out of it than those who are working. But what are you, as an independent advisor, going to do about it? Now, Libertatem was set up not only for independent advisors, but for restricted as well. We did that simply because the regulator decides who is what, and could have decided in an afternoon that what is currently called independent is now restricted, or indeed it could invent a completely new form again in a heartbeat, and we didn't want to restrict our membership to one or the other. For the most part, our members are independent. About 10 to 12% are either restricted or restricted and independent. There are companies that do both. So that is the where we're going in the autumn. We're going to get out and start explaining to members of Parliament what the issues are with regulation and what needs to be done about it. It will eventually require legislation. That's fine. That is what the House of Commons is there to do, create legislation. And we need to now create a legislation that works for consumers and for those who are in the industry, as well as for the powerful who can use regulation as a way of getting out of their responsibilities to the consumer. So we now know what the issues are, but how are we going to deal with them? Well, firstly, this is the best opportunity we've seen in 20 years for change in the regulatory process. The change in politics has will make a huge difference, but also the regulator is probably in its weakest position for the last 20 years. It fails, the government has stopped being this elitist body and is now determined to actually deliver policies for everybody. Well, those everybodies include us, so we're going to get involved. We know of at least 120 backbenchers who are supportive. Indeed, the Libertatem membership covers about nearly 200 constituencies, some with more than one advisor for each MP. And that is the start, of course, of our autumn campaign. And Brexit generally will lead to, in the long term, to better regulation. We won't have the regulatory factory in Brussels pumping out things which the FCA is attempting to compete with, or gold plate. And Labour, the Labour Party, which for a long time has been a cheerleader for more regulation, is not really in a position to suggest that at the moment. So what can you do for Libertatem? Well, firstly, you can stop accepting the status quo cannot be changed, because it very clearly can. The world has changed in the last little while. The Brexit vote wasn't just a vote against Europe, it was a vote against the way we are ruled and the sort of abuses that we have seen in the regulatory system in the financial services. So you can join, you can encourage others to join, or if you don't want to join for some bizarre reason, you can contribute to our fighting fund. You can organise locally, and most important, you can go out and lobby your MP. Get them listening and understanding about how the current unaccountable system doesn't work not only for you, but far more importantly for your clients. Your clients are currently paying around 25% of their fees in regulatory costs. That simply cannot be sustained, and those costs continue to go up. There is a point, and it will be pretty soon, where the cost of regulation is greater than the cost of your advice, particularly the case with VAT involved. So we need, this current situation is unsustainable. We need to change it. Let us change it rather than someone else. Let's stop reacting to things. Let's stop trying to mitigate the issues and actually get back to principles and work out what is required from the regulator. And then as advisors, let us start dealing with the profession that we claim to be and actually acting like a profession. Now that will require work, not only from Libertatem, but from professional organisations and others. And we're very happy to work with others to achieve it. But we can't do it without your help. So what are you going to do having watched this video? Are you just going to sit there and think, yeah, that's really good. Don't pat me on the head any further. I've had 18 months of being patted on the head by advisors. Join us, get involved. Actually take control of your own industry again. And I'm sure all of it is doable if we only have the wit and the ability to do it. So come and join Libertatem today and make a difference to your industry and make a difference to your clients.